Hey everyone, my name is Eric Croft. I am finishing my third year of the MDiv program. I live in Metro Detroit with my wife Kaylee and our dog Cairo. We've lived here for 6 years now. I am on staff at a church. I am an associate pastor. I do communications. I was the youth pastor at one point. Now I am the discipleship pastor. And that actually leads me to my experience of preaching. And as part of this church, I am probably the person who speaks the second most behind our lead pastor. I would say I preach 5 to 6 times a year in that context to our whole church community on Sunday mornings. Now, it is important to add in that as youth pastor, that role was not necessarily my full calling, but at the same time, I did recognize that I got to speak every week, and I did preach every week until the COVID pandemic happened, and then that kind of shifted, obviously, as it did for many of us. But in that, I've been preaching consistently for the last 6 years since I graduated my undergrad, and yeah, it's been a journey. I love looking back and listening to some old sermons and walking through some other pastors as they begin to develop their preaching, because I've been able to just see my experience develop and also see how I continue to develop and desire to develop. And I also do continue to listen to sermons, people that are in and outside of my network, people who I like a lot, people that I like to take their practices. Like I love Erwin McManus. I think he's one of the best communicators. Content aside, I think he knows very well how to tell a story and how to engage others. Same with Judah Smith. He's very good at telling story and engaging other people. My current understanding of the gospel, this is a great question. Not because I have a great answer. I'd say my current understanding is very much more focused on living rather than declaring. And that's something that I wanted to bring into this course. As I was listening to the lectures for this week, I really was the person who, while I don't think it's unnecessary, I think it's very important to preach the word. I'm in a context that often equates preaching with church, not as a portion of the church. So I tend to push back against preaching too much because, especially in my church context, I see people, they shift their faith and they shift their actions away from doing to just listening. And it ends up not really being full listening because they just gather a sermon or experience a sermon and then move on. But I understand the gospel as sharing the story and life of Jesus and becoming an apprentice of him. And that definitively takes guidance of the preaching word, of scriptural word, but also the word of the Spirit and the Spirit working in us and through us. And I think that's very, very important. My current understanding of the most significant 4 or 5 characteristics that constitute a good sermon. So I would not identify myself as Baptist, but I grew up in a lot of Baptist contexts. And I think the first thing I would say is it should be clear. And I say this because I'm surrounded by many people who like alliteration and they like these snappy things. And sometimes I think that those are done, I know they're done to be memorable, but often I find that they're so emphasized that you tend to miss the meaning, or it tends to be a bit convoluted because you're looking for that one letter in the word. I would say next is concise. I think especially nowadays as their attention spans are lessening, not that people can't understand as much, but as I'm speaking unilaterally, that attention is difficult, especially for non-auditory learners. So I think being as concise as possible, I think, is the caveat. It doesn't have to be very short, but as concise as possible. Unnecessary fluff, I think, is significantly worse now than it used to be. So clear, concise, accurate. I also have a big emphasis on if it's not accurate, then it's not worth whatever cute mnemonic device or whatever long, elaborate lecture or oratory was given. It needs to be accurate. And lastly, I would say it needs to be practical. Theology is meant to be practical from the beginning. And if we give a sermon that is all up in the head and doesn't affect our heart or affect our hands, I think that's very important. So if my goal for this class, or some hopes I have for this class, are to fall in love with preaching again I used to love to preach. I used to love to listen to sermons, and I've been so burnt out by, when I say bad preaching, not bad communicators, but bad preaching that doesn't place Jesus at the center and it places the preacher at the center. And so I would really love to fall in love with this concept again as an avenue to marry people with Jesus once again. So that's probably my biggest hope for this class. I'm excited to learn and hopefully be a better communicator and better preacher because of it.